Charles Bronson wasn't just tough on screen, he had some serious grudges off it too. He didn't hold back when it came to calling out actors he couldn't stand. But who were the 5 people that really got under his skin? Ready to find out who made Bronson's blacklist? Bronson versus James Coburn. When The Magnificent Seven started filming in 1960, the cast was packed with strong personalities. Steve McQueen, Yul Brynner, and James Coburn were all climbing towards stardom. But even in that group, Charles Bronson stood apart. He wasn't loud or flashy, he just showed up, did the work, and expected everyone else to take it just as seriously. That's where the trouble began between him and James Coburn. Coburn brought a completely different vibe to the set. He was relaxed, smooth-talking, and had this effortless, easygoing charm that made him approachable and likable, both on camera and off. Many people found his laid-back demeanor refreshing. It helped lighten the atmosphere during long, grueling shoots. Between takes, Coburn would often crack jokes or toss out quirky, unexpected comments that kept the mood from getting too heavy. For some, this was a welcome break, a way to ease tension and make the workday more enjoyable. But Bronson saw it another way. To him, Coburn's casual attitude felt careless and unprofessional. He believed that acting demanded total focus and discipline, that every scene deserved full respect and dedication. Bronson wasn't interested in distractions or lighthearted banter. He thought it undermined the seriousness of their craft. Where Coburn saw moments of levity as part of the process, Bronson saw them as a sign of laziness or lack of commitment. He believed actors had a duty to stay sharp, engaged, and fully present at all times, treating each scene with the weight it deserved. This fundamental difference in their approach to work created a subtle but palpable tension between the two on set. It didn't take long for the differences to show. Bronson wasn't the kind of man who complained openly, but those close to the production noticed the tension. One crew member, quoted years later in a behind-the-scenes account, said Bronson once told a friend, "He thinks this is a vacation. I'm here to work." While it wasn't a direct shot at Coburn, everyone understood who he meant. Bronson didn't tolerate distractions, and Coburn's casual style came off as a lack of respect for the craft. Even when they shared scenes, the contrast was obvious. Coburn would throw in a smirk or a small improvisation, trying to bring a bit of flair to his role. Bronson, on the other hand, stuck to the script, kept a straight face, and didn't appreciate anyone stealing focus or playing loose with direction. That kind of behavior felt like a threat to the structure he valued. It wasn't an explosive feud, but more of a slow burn. Bronson didn't lash out or cause drama, but he distanced himself. He spoke very little to Coburn off camera and avoided any unnecessary interaction. While Coburn tried to keep things friendly, Bronson stayed cold, keeping the wall up the whole time they worked together. In later years, Coburn would speak fondly of the cast and the experience. Bronson never mentioned him. That silence said enough. He didn't waste words on people he didn't care for, and Coburn had landed in that category. Their personalities were just too far apart. Bronson thrived on grit and discipline. Coburn leaned into charm and flow. When you put those two in the same frame, the friction was almost built in. They managed to get through the project, but it wasn't without strain. Still, as much as Coburn annoyed Bronson, he wasn't the worst of them. There was one actor who pushed all of Bronson's buttons, someone even bigger, more popular, and more demanding. If Coburn got on his nerves, this next guy almost made Bronson boil. Fireworks with Steve McQueen? When The Great Escape went into production in 1963, the cast was already stacked with big names, but no one cast a longer shadow than Steve McQueen. By then, McQueen was becoming a household name, and he knew it. He had that mix of cool confidence and screen presence that pulled audiences in. But behind the scenes, that same confidence rubbed Charles Bronson the wrong way, and it wasn't hard to see why. Bronson had little patience for those who seemed desperate for the spotlight. He valued professionalism and believed that the work should come first, not individual ego. McQueen, despite his undeniable talent, had a tendency to make every scene about himself. He wasn't content simply to act, He pushed for extra camera time, often trying to shift the focus to highlight his presence. McQueen would sometimes alter scenes or dialogue to better fit his carefully crafted image, putting his own interests above the story or the director's vision. What frustrated Bronson most was McQueen's insistence on performing his own stunts. While this might sound admirable, McQueen's approach sometimes ignored safety protocols or disrupted established routines, putting both himself and the crew at risk. To Bronson, this was reckless and showed a disregard for the collective effort that filmmaking required. For Bronson, filmmaking was a team effort where everyone's role mattered. He respected the crew, the director, and the script, and he expected others to do the same. McQueen's behavior, driven by ego and a desire for control, wasn't just irritating. It crossed the line into unprofessionalism. It clashed with Bronson's belief in discipline, respect, and sticking to the plan. During filming, it became obvious that there was a power game happening between the two. McQueen wanted to shine, and Bronson wasn't interested in playing backup. While their characters didn't always cross paths directly, the tension between them could be felt across the set. Bronson wasn't loud about it. He didn't throw tantrums or argue in public, but he made it clear through his body language and sharp silences that he didn't care for the showmanship. One crew member later shared that Bronson once said McQueen was more worried about the motorcycle than the movie. That wasn't just a dig. It was a summary of everything he disliked about actors who treated films like platforms for personal glory. There were even reports that Bronson turned down a few shared promotional appearances after the movie wrapped. He didn't want to be part of the publicity circus, especially not when it involved pretending to be friends with someone he didn't respect. McQueen, for his part, never addressed the friction directly, but he also didn't seem to care whether Bronson approved of him or not. He was focused on building his legend, and Bronson wasn't interested in being part of it. What really bothered Bronson was more than just ego. It was the idea that someone could treat the craft like a playground. Bronson grew up poor, worked his way up from nothing, and saw acting as a serious job. McQueen, though also from a tough background, embraced the wild side of fame, fast cars, flashy clothes, parties, and press attention. That lifestyle didn't impress Bronson. If anything, it made him shut off even more. Their working relationship stayed professional, but that's about as far as it went. They didn't speak much outside of what was required, and when the cameras stopped rolling, Bronson usually kept his distance. McQueen's star kept rising after The Great Escape, but Bronson didn't care to ride that wave. He stuck to what he believed in, even if it meant standing alone. And while Bronson could put up with the flash and ego to a certain extent, there was one kind of personality he just couldn't stomach. Someone who wore their ego like a badge of honor and treated acting like a constant performance, even off-screen. That's where things really started to boil over with the next name on his list. Tony Curtis and the ego problem. Charles Bronson never got along with actors who were too polished for their own good, and Tony Curtis checked every box that rubbed him the wrong way. Their paths crossed professionally, most notably around Kid Galahad, and also through the Hollywood social circles they both moved in, but just barely. While Curtis was the kind of actor who embraced the limelight and leaned into his star persona, Bronson kept his distance from that kind of world. The disconnect between them wasn't just professional, it was personal. Curtis had a movie star presence, slicked back hair, designer suits, public charm, and a taste for the glamorous side of the business. He was often seen mingling at parties, cracking jokes with reporters, and soaking up the attention. Bronson saw that as fake. He had no respect for people who acted one way on screen and turned into someone completely different when the cameras were off. And with Curtis, Bronson saw a man who lived for image. That didn't sit well with someone like him, who believed hard work spoke louder than charm or fashion. People who knew both of them recalled that Bronson often mocked Curtis behind his back. He'd make comments about Curtis spending more time in makeup than rehearsing lines, or how he seemed more interested in how he looked walking onto a set than in actually delivering a solid performance. Bronson came from a background where survival wasn't guaranteed. He worked in coal mines before he ever touched a script. So to him, someone like Curtis, who had Hollywood handed to him early on and soaked in every spotlight, felt out of touch with reality. Years later, a story circulated, though likely exaggerated, that perfectly captured Bronson's attitude toward Curtis. During a group meeting on a project where both men were present, Bronson supposedly leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "All hair, no spine." Whether or not those exact words were spoken isn't really important. What mattered was the sentiment behind them, a blunt reflection of how Bronson viewed Curtis. To Bronson, Curtis was all style and flash, but lacking any real substance or strength of character. He saw someone more interested in appearance and showmanship than genuine depth or commitment. That kind of superficiality clashed with everything Bronson valued. He believed true talent came with discipline and inner toughness, qualities he didn't see in Curtis. This dismissive attitude wasn't just about professional differences. It spoke to a deeper frustration. Bronson couldn't respect someone who prioritized image over integrity, or who seemed more focused on the spotlight than the work itself. In Bronson's eyes, Curtis's flashy exterior was a mask hiding a lack of backbone, and that made it impossible for Bronson to take him seriously. The story stuck because it perfectly summed up the unspoken tension and Bronson's quiet disdain. To make matters worse, Curtis had a way of carrying himself that felt dismissive to people he thought were beneath him. It wasn't always obvious, but Bronson picked up on it. He never liked actors who brought ego to the set. And if someone acted like they were above the crew or didn't show humility in their craft, Bronson mentally checked out from any chance of real camaraderie. That's why even when they shared screen time or ended up at the same industry gatherings, Bronson kept Curtis at arm's length. There was no huge blowout or dramatic fight. It was just quiet, lingering disdain. Bronson didn't need a reason to yell, he just didn't deal with people who didn't match his standard. In Curtis's case, the polished act and polished image were enough to earn a lifelong spot on Bronson's personal blacklist. And while Curtis's vanity irritated him, there was another actor who earned Bronson's dislike for an entirely different reason. Someone he didn't see as arrogant, but simply lacking the backbone to hold his own. Disdain for Alain Delon. When Charles Bronson signed on to do Adieu l'ami in 1968, he likely didn't expect the experience to be as frustrating as it turned out. Sharing the screen with French actor Alain Delon was a professional pairing that looked good on paper. Two major stars, different continents, different styles. But that difference ended up being the root of Bronson's dislike. Delon was everything Bronson wasn't. He was fashion-conscious, polished, and always camera-ready. Known for his sharp features and high society image, Delon embraced fame in a way Bronson couldn't relate to. Delon carried himself like a man who had stepped out of a magazine, and Bronson saw that as a kind of performance that never stopped. It wasn't just about the movie for Delon, it was about how he looked doing it. And for Bronson, that was a problem. On set, their chemistry felt forced. While they managed to work through scenes without much visible friction, there was no real warmth behind the camera. Bronson had a hard time respecting someone who seemed too focused on style. He didn't connect with people who were always checking mirrors or changing wardrobe pieces between takes. One assistant from the production reportedly said Bronson would roll his eyes when Delon took too long in his trailer. These weren't heated arguments, but more of a slow, cold rejection. Bronson didn't want to bond with someone who didn't speak the same professional language. Some film historians later suggested that Bronson may have also felt a little territorial. Delon was already a major star in Europe and had a reputation for being effortlessly charming in front of audiences. While Bronson wasn't the type to admit jealousy, those close to him often said he didn't enjoy working with actors who drew more press or fuss than they deserved. Delon, being the darling of European cinema, fit that mold too well. Years after they worked together, a story about Bronson and Curtis began to circulate, likely exaggerated, but it captured the essence of Bronson's feelings toward Curtis. During a group meeting on a project they both attended, Bronson allegedly leaned over to a colleague and quietly said, "All hair, no spine." Whether he used those exact words or not wasn't as important as the meaning behind them. That phrase summed up Bronson's view of Curtis perfectly. To Bronson, Curtis was all about surface, flashy, stylish, and full of showmanship. But he lacked real substance or strength of character. Bronson valued depth, discipline, and inner toughness, qualities he felt Curtis simply didn't possess. For Bronson, Curtis's focus on image over integrity was frustrating and unprofessional. This wasn't just a difference in working style, it revealed a deeper judgment. Bronson couldn't respect someone who seemed more interested in the spotlight than the craft. He believed true talent required more than just looking good on camera. It demanded commitment and seriousness. Curtis's flashy exterior in Bronson's eyes was a cover for a lack of backbone. That perception of Curtis as all style and no substance defined Bronson's attitude and made it impossible for him to take Curtis seriously. Despite all this, the film was a hit in Europe. But that didn't change how Bronson felt about the experience. He rarely spoke of DeLong after the film wrapped and never worked with him again. For someone like Bronson, silence said a lot more than words. DeLong wasn't someone he fought with openly, but the lack of respect was obvious to anyone who paid attention. If DeLong was a mismatch for Bronson, the next actor on his list was a whole different category. The annoyance gave way to open dislike. This time, the problem wasn't about polish or press. It was about character, and Bronson had no patience for what he saw as weakness. While Bronson's quiet disdain for Connery was rooted in their different lifestyles, his frustration with Marlon Brando cut even deeper, centered on how they viewed the very craft of acting itself. Richard Attenborough. Among the actors Charles Bronson clashed with, Richard Attenborough stood out, not because of explosive arguments, but because Bronson couldn't stand him on a deeper level. They worked together on The Great Escape, and while the film became a classic, the experience behind the scenes wasn't as smooth as it looked on screen. For Bronson, Attenborough embodied everything he disliked about actor types: theatrical, overly trained, and far too polished for his taste. Attenborough came from a respected British acting tradition. His background was stage-heavy, and it showed. He had a way of delivering lines with dramatic flair, paying close attention to diction, posture, and timing. That kind of approach won him praise in critical circles, but for Bronson, it felt fake. Bronson was raw and stripped down. He didn't do flourish. He wanted grit, silence when needed, and a kind of authenticity that didn't require theatrical training. So when he had to work next to someone who looked like he was reciting Shakespeare, Bronson's patience wore thin. There were no fistfights or shouting matches between the two, but the disdain was quiet and constant. Bronson kept his distance during breaks. He wasn't interested in small talk, especially not the polite, rehearsed kind that Attenborough was known for. People around them noticed the disconnect. A co-star once said Bronson looked like he was chewing gravel every time Attenborough started a monologue. That wasn't an exaggeration. Bronson thought Attenborough overacted, always trying to make every moment count a little too much, almost like he was performing for a theater crowd instead of a film camera. It also didn't help that Attenborough's character had more emotional depth in the script, giving him more dramatic moments. That balance might have been fine with other actors, but Bronson didn't like watching people act hard when they hadn't lived hard, and he didn't hide it. According to one biography, Bronson once remarked to a grip, "He's too clean for this story." Meaning, he didn't buy Attenborough's performance as someone stuck in a POW camp, not because Attenborough lacked talent, but because Bronson felt he lacked truth. Their styles clashed so completely that even after the film, Bronson made sure to avoid being paired with Attenborough in future projects. If a director suggested his name, Bronson would shrug it off or change the subject. He didn't explode about it. He just didn't want to deal with someone whose idea of acting felt more like posing to him. The other actors Bronson disliked usually irritated him on a surface level. They were loud, fake, or obsessed with fame, qualities that could be annoying but ultimately felt superficial to him. Attenborough, however, got under Bronson's skin for a deeper reason. It wasn't about noise or ego, it was about style. Bronson had a very specific belief about what acting should be. To him, acting wasn't about looking polished or perfect. It was about showing something raw, real, and lived in. an authentic reflection of life's struggles and imperfections. With Attenborough, Bronson saw the exact opposite. His performances felt too neat, too controlled. It was all technique, rehearsed movements, and calculated delivery without the grit or struggle that Bronson valued. To Bronson, acting that lacked this emotional roughness was empty, like a beautiful mask with no real feeling behind it. Attenborough's style seemed to prioritize perfection over authenticity, which clashed with Bronson's deeply held view that acting should expose vulnerability, flaws, and the messy truth of human experience. This fundamental difference made Attenborough one of the few actors who truly rubbed Bronson the wrong way, not because of arrogance or fame-seeking, but because their approach to the craft was worlds apart. Bronson versus Sean Connery. When people talk about the ultimate tough guys of classic Hollywood, two names always come up: Charles Bronson and Sean Connery. Both were powerful screen presences, known for their strong jaws, quiet intensity, and a kind of masculinity that defined an era. But off-screen, they couldn't have been more different, and that difference is exactly why Bronson never liked Connery. Bronson lived a quiet life. He wasn't interested in red carpets, interviews, or being the center of attention. If he wasn't filming, he was usually at home or somewhere far from the Hollywood buzz. He didn't crave the spotlight and didn't try to be anyone's hero. That was just who he was: low profile, straightforward, and completely uninterested in fame for fame's sake. Connery, on the other hand, leaned into the fame. He moved in elite circles, played golf with royals, attended luxury events, and carried himself with a kind of pride that people either admired or found unbearable. Connery knew he was a star, and he didn't hide it. He was stylish, confident, and often came across like someone who believed his own legend. And to someone like Bronson, that kind of attitude was a problem. The two didn't clash in the way you might expect. There were no loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Their dislike for each other was quiet, distant, and cold. When their paths crossed, which wasn't often, the energy was stiff. They'd nod, maybe exchange a few words, but that was it. No warmth, no interest, no effort to connect. It was the kind of politeness that masks a clear dislike. Insiders who worked around them noticed the gap immediately. Bronson didn't go out of his way to badmouth Connery, but it was clear he had no respect for the way Connery carried himself. He thought Connery was too wrapped up in his image, too eager to live like a celebrity. Bronson wasn't impressed by men who acted like they were larger than life, and Connery, whether he meant to or not, gave off exactly that vibe. This wasn't just a personality issue, it was also about values. Bronson believed in hard work, humility, and showing up without needing to be treated like royalty. Connery's polished public persona, the tailored suits, the charm, the elite lifestyle, all of it went against the grain of what Bronson stood for. It didn't help that Connery didn't seem to care much about winning Bronson over either. The feeling was mutual, and neither of them tried to hide it. They only worked near each other a couple of times, and even then, their interactions stayed professional and limited. There were no heated moments, but no effort to build any kind of relationship either. You could tell they were just going through the motions, no behind-the-scenes bonding, no friendly chats between takes, just cold professionalism. It was all very businesslike, and once the job was done, they went their separate ways. That distance never closed. In fact, it hardened over time. Bronson didn't speak much about Connery in public, but those who knew him say his opinion never changed. He saw Connery as someone who took himself too seriously, someone who acted like he was above the rest of the cast and crew. And for a guy like Bronson, who came from humble beginnings and stayed grounded, that kind of attitude was never going to sit well. So, while they both stood at the top of Hollywood in their own ways, they existed on completely different tracks. One kept things modest and private, the other enjoyed the perks and spotlight that came with being a star. That quiet but firm divide is exactly why you never saw them working side by side again, and never will. While Connery's polished arrogance irritated Bronson, another Hollywood legend sparked an even deeper level of frustration in him, one that wasn't about ego, but about the very craft of acting itself. Bronson versus Marlon Brando. Charles Bronson didn't like nonsense. That was clear to anyone who worked with him. He was the kind of actor who came to set on time, knew his lines, did his job, and expected everyone else to do the same. That's part of why he had zero patience for Marlon Brando. While Brando was widely praised as one of the most gifted actors of his time, Bronson couldn't care less about the hype. To him, Brando wasn't a genius. He was a headache. Their differences started with how they approached their work. Brando was all about method acting. He believed in emotional truth, staying in character, and going deep into a role until it became part of him. That sounds noble in theory, but in practice, it often meant delays, mood swings, and unpredictable behavior on set. Brando had a reputation for showing up late, changing lines on the spot, and pushing scenes well past what the script required. Some directors gave him the space to do it, thinking brilliance would come out of the chaos. Bronson thought it was just laziness wrapped in ego. Where Brando brought intensity, Bronson brought control. He had a no-frills style, sharp, focused, and deliberate. He didn't need to do 20 takes to find the truth of a scene. He believed in preparation, discipline, and respecting the people you worked with. That's why Brando's dramatic method and everything that came with it just didn't sit right with him. Bronson didn't see it as deep or artistic. He saw it as a distraction. Bronson wasn't subtle about how he felt either. He once said he didn't need 1,000 takes and a meltdown to find a character which, to anyone paying attention, was clearly aimed at Brando. It wasn't just about style, it was about principle. Bronson saw acting as a job. You were there to help tell a story, not to turn the set into your personal therapy session. When an actor's behavior made life harder for everyone else, Bronson checked out. And in Brando's case, he didn't bother hiding his opinion. Their personalities didn't click either. Brando was larger than life, moody, unpredictable, and at times totally absorbed in himself. Bronson, on the other hand, didn't care for theatrics. He didn't like people who made everything about them. And Brando, with his long history of clashing with directors and doing things his own way, came off exactly like that. It wasn't just a professional disagreement, it was personal. The two actors never worked together in a major project. That wasn't by accident. Bronson had no interest in sharing the screen with someone he didn't respect, and Brando probably had no idea, or didn't care, how much Bronson disliked him. But those close to Bronson knew he found Brando's reputation inflated. He thought the industry gave Brando too much credit for being difficult, when in reality he just lacked discipline. To Bronson, talent wasn't an excuse to act like you were above everyone else. At the end of the day, Bronson believed in showing up, doing the work, and keeping things simple. Brando believed in digging deep, even if it meant taking the long way around. They weren't just two actors with different styles, they were on opposite ends of the spectrum. And for Bronson, that gap was too wide to ignore. He didn't just avoid Brando, he dismissed him entirely. In his eyes, Brando wasn't the master of his craft. He was the guy who made the job harder than it needed to be. And Bronson never had time for that. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.